Picture this: a relentless storm looming overhead, the howling wind threatening to tear through a Pennsylvania farm, and our main character's only tractor, old, rusted, and essential to his survival, suddenly grinds to a halt. In that moment, a mysterious stranger arrives in a vintage Porsche, offering tools and expertise that seem too good to be true. Next thing you know, a small key engraved with the words Zürich Trust surfaces, hinting at a hidden fortune tied to wartime secrets. Sounds unbelievable, right? But that's exactly how our story kicks off, sending us on a whirlwind journey through generations of sacrifice, hidden alliances, and a community standing firm against corporate takeover. If you're curious to see how this thrilling twist unfolds and whether our hero can truly unlock the legacy left by his grandfather, stick with us to the end of the tale. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us to bring more incredible stories like this one, packed with action, mystery, and timeless values worth fighting for. Tom Marshall, 52 years old and dogged by a weariness that had seeped into his bones over the years, stood on the front porch of Meadow Springs Farm, the place he had called home since childhood. The farm's weathered boards creaked under his boots, a familiar symphony that reminded him of earlier days, days when this porch bustled with lively conversations. The voice of his grandfather, Colonel Harold Marshall, resonating through the air. Back then, Tom was a boy trailing along the planks, listening to old war stories filtered through the gentle hush of a radio playing big band tunes inside. Now, the vast silence hung heavy. The main house showed signs of neglect, a sagging gutter along the eaves, a wind chime twisted out of shape by countless storms, and paint peeling in long, tired strips. Finances were tight, and even the smallest repairs seemed like extravagant luxuries he could not afford. As Tom gazed out at the rolling acreage, he thought about the family that once filled these rooms, especially his grandfather, who had purchased Meadow Springs after returning from World War II. Colonel Harold Marshall had been a revered figure in Tom's eyes, a man whose fortitude, discipline, and unwavering moral compass guided the family. Tom still remembered how his grandfather used to sit in the old rocking chair, reading letters by the soft glow of a single lamp. He would talk about sacrifice in hushed tones, sometimes trailing off into silence that hinted at the horrors he had witnessed overseas. When the colonel passed away, the farm's upkeep fell on Tom's parents, then eventually on Tom himself after they, too, passed. Over the years, the sense of heritage and pride that once radiated through these fields had become overshadowed by unpaid bills, unpredictable weather, and the creeping feeling that the world had moved on without him. The last few years had tested Tom's endurance. A failed marriage left him living alone in the big farmhouse, the echo of footsteps in hallways reminding him of what he lost. Most days, he mustered the discipline he'd learned from the colonel, forcing himself to tend the fields and feed the livestock. The sense of belonging that used to make him proud had grown tenuous as corporate agriculture swallowed neighboring homesteads. Almost every farm around him was now owned or in talks to be bought by Land Dominion Group, a powerful conglomerate known for assembling massive acreages to streamline production. They offered handsome sums to those too exhausted or too broke to continue. Tom had turned them down twice, but the memory of those rejections weighed on him. Another phone call might come any day with a more persuasive figure. And if that call came, Tom wasn't entirely sure how he would respond. Standing on the porch, clutching a steaming mug of coffee, he watched the morning sun cast long shadows across the fields of wheat. Harvest season was closing in. Just a couple more weeks, and he would need to drive his aging tractor across these acres to bring in what was shaping up to be a decent yield. He took a slow, thoughtful sip, remembering how the colonel once explained to him that wheat was not just a crop, it was a symbol of life's resilience, a testament that even after the coldest winters, growth could flourish under the right care. If he failed to harvest, or if equipment broke down at the wrong moment, the resulting financial blow might be the final straw. The thought unsettled him, and yet he clung to the farm like a drowning man grabbing a piece of flotsam, determined to keep alive the legacy that ran through his blood. On a sweltering afternoon, just days before the forecast called for a significant storm, Tom wrestled with the temperamental tractor that had once been new back in the 1980s. The old John Deere, covered in rust freckles and caked mud, rattled and coughed with every turn of the key. He had performed his usual rituals, checking the oil, replacing a few hoses, tightening loose bolts. Despite his best efforts, the engine sputtered and cut out, sending him off the seat in frustration. He wiped the sweat from his brow and took a moment to glance skyward, noticing the darkening horizon. A storm was coming earlier than expected. The looming threat of torrential rain made Tom hyper-aware of how critical this machine was to his survival. If the tractor failed now, he wouldn't be able to prep the fields or shift equipment to safer ground. One major downpour could damage the wheat fields, drowning out a portion of his potential harvest income. Grim scenarios piled up in his head. What if the tractor broke for good? What if he couldn't salvage enough of the crop to keep up with mortgage payments? What if Land Dominion Group made yet another pressuring call at exactly the wrong moment? Each question felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. As he squatted beside the tractor, fiddling with the spark plugs he suspected might be at fault, an old picture flashed in his memory, the colonel standing tall beside this very piece of machinery in its earlier days, a proud smile on his face as he demonstrated how to shift gears. Tom remembered being a young boy, riding on the edge of the seat, gripping the colonel's arm in excitement. That recollection stirred a sense of responsibility within him. He couldn't let the colonel's life's work die on his watch. He decided to give the tractor a break. Maybe it was overheating, so he turned his attention to the horizon again. The clouds were definitely rolling in faster than the weatherman had predicted. Fat, dark masses drifted closer, an ominous undercurrent swirling beneath them. Tom trudged back to the farmhouse, leaving the tractor out in the fields, hoping that the cooling engine might magically kick back to life when he returned. He flicked on the kitchen radio, scanning for any storm advisories, but only static greeted him. When he caught a crackling snippet of local news, it mentioned some roads already flooded up north, the wind gusts picking up to dangerous speeds. Inside the kitchen, the walls were adorned with old family photographs, each a small window into a happier, busier past. One black and white shot showed Colonel Harold Marshall in uniform, arms folded, standing next to an army jeep somewhere in Europe. Another displayed Tom's parents on their wedding day, beaming with the kind of hope that once seemed abundant. Tom looked at those photos and felt a pang in his chest, a mix of longing and defiance. He wondered if they would approve of his choices, or if they might urge him to swallow his pride and accept an offer to sell. But then he recalled his grandfather's voice, always encouraging perseverance, even when things felt insurmountable. Returning to the porch, he felt the first few drops of rain strike his face. The wind picked up, stirring the tall wheat into fluid, shifting waves. There was a primal beauty to it, a reminder that nature obeyed no contract and answered to no corporation. In that fleeting moment, Tom felt more determined than ever. He would fix that tractor or find a way to keep his operation alive, storm or no storm, come what may. The rain escalated that very evening. Sheets of water drummed against the windows, lightning forked across the sky, and thunder vibrated through the farmhouse's old wooden beams. Tom set out buckets in the living room to catch water from leaks he hadn't gotten around to patching. By midnight, the storm had worsened, with fierce gusts rattling the shutters and sending branches skittering across the yard. Tom kept glancing at the tractor through the window, its silhouette faintly illuminated by flashes of lightning, half convinced it might be blown away or further damaged. But the real worry pounded in his chest if he couldn't get the machine running by morning. How would he ensure the fields were prepped at the height of the storm? An unexpected sound drew him away from the window. A car engine, smooth and low, unlike any pickup truck or standard sedan. He peered outside and saw headlights inching down his muddy driveway. It was something small, with a sleek shape. He couldn't fathom who would venture out in these conditions, or why anyone would drive such a car on a rutted path better suited for four-wheel drives. Tom grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the porch, the wind nearly yanking the door from his grip. As the car came to a halt, its headlights revealed it to be an old sports car, perhaps a Porsche from the 1970s, though Tom couldn't be sure in the darkness. The door swung open and out stepped a tall figure wearing a dark raincoat. water streaming off in rivulets. The stranger held up a hand as if in greeting or surrender. By the next bolt of lightning, Tom could see the stranger had a composed, almost regal bearing. No panic or hesitation despite the raging storm. Huddling beneath the narrow overhang, Tom shouted over the wind, "What in God's name are you doing out here?" The stranger introduced himself as Felix Bauer, a Swiss engineer traveling through the region. Claiming he'd seen the flicker of lights and hoped for a place to ride out the storm. His accent was soft, hinting at a European background, though it had an American lilt that suggested he'd been stateside for some time. Tom, caught between suspicion and basic decency, gestured him inside. In the mudroom, Felix removed his soaked coat, revealing a lean physique and a calm demeanor that felt almost military. He apologized for intruding, explaining that the severe weather had made visibility nearly impossible on back roads. Tom nodded but remained cautious, sizing up this unexpected visitor. Felix's eyes flicked across the house, taking in the worn furniture, the flickering lanterns Tom had lit in case the power failed. When asked why he was driving a vintage Porsche in the middle of a storm, Felix merely shrugged and said he'd been on a particular errand and found older cars easier to maintain himself. Before Tom could question him further, the stranger politely asked if there was anything he could do to help. Something about Felix's voice and the way he carried himself, a certain poised vigilance, stirred Tom's curiosity. Though wariness tugged at Tom's mind, the immediate crisis of the storm took precedence. Together, they shut windows, secured loose items on the porch, and mopped up water that had seeped under the door. Outside, wind howled and rain hammered, but for the first time in months, Tom didn't feel entirely alone. By the time morning arrived, the storm had left its mark. Branches littered the driveway, and the fields glistened under a gloomy sky. Tom found himself making coffee for two in the kitchen, a scene he hadn't pictured for years. Felix Bauer appeared from the guest bedroom, where Tom had insisted he spend the night rather than sleeping in that old Porsche. Over steaming mugs, they exchanged polite small talk. It started with typical courtesy. Where are you heading? Why a farm like this, but soon deepened into the kind of exchange that happens when two strangers recognize shared grit. Felix noticed the photos on the wall. One in particular caught his eye, Colonel Harold Marshall in uniform, standing beside what looked to be an army truck. Felix asked about it, and Tom, somewhat reluctantly, explained who the colonel was and how he'd earned multiple commendations in World War II before returning home to start a family and buy Meadow Springs Farm. Felix listened attentively, his brow furrowing at certain details. As though they resonated with something he already knew, eventually, talk drifted to the battered tractor that Tom desperately needed to fix. He mentioned that it had sputtered out last evening before the storm. Felix's face lit up with a practical kind of interest. "I know a bit about engines," he said, swirling his coffee. "Perhaps we can take a look." Skeptical but with nothing to lose, Tom led Felix outside. The air was still heavy with moisture, and the sky threatened another downpour. The two men trudged through mud until they reached the stranded John Deere. Tom explained every problem he'd tried to fix, how the engine refused to turn over, how the transmission had been shaky for months. Felix listened carefully, then opened a compact toolkit he retrieved from his Porsche. To Tom's surprise, the kit was extensive, featuring well-organized wrenches, ratchets, and other specialized equipment. Under the hood, Felix worked systematically, diagnosing the engine in a manner that felt both meticulous and second nature. Tom stood by, arms crossed, half in awe and half in doubt. When Felix muttered something about chemical degradation on the belts, Tom raised an eyebrow. This was more than a casual fix. The Swiss engineer's knowledge seemed borderline expert. In less than an hour, he removed several damaged parts, pointed out the reason for their failure, and laid them on a clean tarp to prevent them from getting lost in the mud. As they labored, Tom found himself increasingly curious about Felix's background. How many Swiss engineers carried a trunk full of specialized tools and possessed the dexterity to remove a tractor's transmission housing under swirling clouds? Yet he held his questions. Practical tasks took priority over curiosity. If Felix could resurrect the tractor, that alone would be a minor miracle worth any dose of suspicion. Finally, Felix straightened and said, "I'm missing a spare part I'd usually have for certain military-grade repairs." The words echoed strangely. Military grade. Before Tom could probe, Felix offered a confident smile. "I can improvise, but it might take another hour or two." Tom nodded, surprised by his own willingness to trust a near stranger. With the storm's approach, time was of the essence, and for whatever reason, Felix Bauer had arrived right when Tom needed help the most. Felix's makeshift repair turned out to be more than a simple patch job. Over the next 2 hours, Tom watched him jury-rig a system that bypassed the tractor's failing belt mechanism. Despite muddy conditions and a drizzle that restarted, Felix worked with steady hands, occasionally requesting that Tom pass a specific wrench or hold a flashlight at a certain angle. It was clear he wasn't consulting any manual. Every movement was guided by memory and experience. Eventually, Felix gestured for Tom to hop back into the tractor's seat. "Let's see," he said, stepping aside with a note of anticipation in his voice. Tom turned the key and felt the machine then roar to life. Though the engine noise was still a bit rough, it maintained a steady rumble that it hadn't produced in months. A broad smile spread across Tom's face, though it was tinged with a hint of confusion. He slid down from the tractor, wiping his hands on his jeans. "This is incredible," Tom said, meeting Felix's gaze. "You sure you're just an engineer?" The corner of Felix's mouth twitched in a barely there smile. "I've worked in a variety of fields," he replied, "some more straightforward than others." There was a gentleness in his tone that disarmed Tom's skepticism, at least for the moment. They walked back to the farmhouse, passing rows of wheat shimmering under the post-storm sunlight. The clouds had thinned, allowing patches of blue sky to break through. Tom offered Felix a place to wash up and insisted he stay for lunch. Something about the entire morning had shifted Tom's perspective. The uneasy sense of isolation that had haunted him felt temporarily replaced by cautious optimism. As they washed up, Felix eyed the old photographs on the living room wall again. One had Colonel Harold Marshall standing with a group of fellow soldiers, each uniform embroidered with a different set of insignias. When they finally sat at the kitchen table, Tom placed a few hastily made sandwiches on mismatched plates. He expected small talk, maybe more details about Felix's engineering background or how he'd come to own such a pristine vintage Porsche. Instead, Felix leaned forward, voice dropping to a quiet register. "You mentioned Colonel Marshall was in World War II. Did he ever talk about what he did over there?" The question contained an undercurrent of genuine interest, maybe even personal stake. Tom shrugged, chewing thoughtfully before answering. He rarely mentioned specifics, just said there were missions behind enemy lines, that sort of thing. I do remember him once saying something about hidden treasures and stolen art, but I thought it was just rumor or talk among soldiers. Felix's eyes flickered, as though he'd found a piece of a puzzle. Outside, the sky shifted from gray to a pale, hopeful yellow. The battered farmhouse kitchen took on a cozy glow. Tom felt the weight of the colonel's legacy for the first time in years. He had always relegated his grandfather's stories to a shadowy corner of family lore. Now, seeing Felix's reaction, he wondered if there was more truth to those stories than he had ever given credit for. The hum of the tractor in the distance, newly repaired and purring as though it had fresh life, felt symbolic of something larger at work, an intersection of past secrets and present survival. Later that afternoon, they were interrupted by the growl of an engine approaching this time. Not the smooth hum of a vintage sports car, but the rough sputter of an old pickup. The truck kicked up muddy water as it slid to a halt. Out stepped Adam Mitchell, a longtime neighbor and dairy farmer. Tom knew Adam well enough to recognize the tension in his posture. Adam was a man rarely rattled by anything but the most pressing crisis. "Tom," Adam called, waving from the truck. "Didn't think you'd be out here with the storm and all. Mind if I come in?" He nodded politely at Felix, but looked him over with a mix of curiosity and distrust. Felix responded with a courteous nod, stepping aside to allow Adam onto the porch. Inside the kitchen, Tom brewed another pot of coffee. Adam glanced around, eventually resting his gaze on Felix. "We've had some trouble down at the dairy," Adam began, rubbing his temples as though pushing back a headache. "Land Dominion. They're sending out new buyout offers. Some folks are caving." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Heard they were looking at your place again, too." Tom felt his chest tighten. The presence of this corporate entity cast a long shadow over all the local farms. Rejections only seemed to spur Land Dominion to refine their tactics, offering bigger checks or subtler pressures. Before Tom could respond, Felix interjected, "These offers, they come with conditions that aren't immediately obvious, don't they?" His calm, measured tone made it sound more like a statement than a question. Adam studied Felix for a moment, sipping from his coffee. "Yeah, you could say that. They promise big payouts, maybe let you keep a corner of your land. But once you sign, it's all for show. They consolidate everything under one mega operation. The farmer's freedom becomes a marketing slogan. In reality, you answer to them." Tom exhaled slowly. "I'm not selling. At least not yet." He glanced at Felix, recalling the mention of hidden treasures and old war missions. The swirl of half-formed thoughts made his mind race. Could there be some link between the colonel's service and the farm's precarious position now? Was that a far-fetched notion? Or was there a kernel of truth behind these recent twists of fate? Adam shifted the conversation to more urgent matters. The new offers are timed for harvest season. Weather's been wild, and Land Dominion knows half of us are behind on loans. They're banking on desperation. Tom nodded. He felt desperation creeping up daily. But now, with Felix's sudden appearance and the tractor miraculously fixed, he experienced a flicker of hope. Felix maintained a listening stance, occasionally asking incisive questions about how Land Dominion structured these deals, how they regulated water rights, and what the typical timelines were for finalizing a sale. Adam seemed both impressed and puzzled by the outsider's clear grasp of agricultural economics. Eventually, Adam finished his coffee, thanked Tom, and left with a subdued nod to Felix. Once the pickup disappeared down the road, Tom found Felix studying him intently. "Corporate acquisition is the new battlefield," Felix remarked quietly, echoing the colonel's old sentiment that war might change its uniform, but never its nature. Tom realized Felix had turned his attention to a small wooden box on the shelf, a box the colonel had once used to store letters. The flicker in Felix's gaze hinted that the conversation between them was about to veer into uncharted territory. "Mind if I look inside this?" Felix asked, gesturing to the wooden box. Tom hesitated. It held remnants of the colonel's past old letters, a tarnished insignia pin, and a few postcards from Europe. He'd flipped through them a handful of times, never finding much more than cryptic references to far-off places. Still, the thought of a virtual stranger digging into family history put him on edge. However, something in Felix's demeanor, a strange blend of reverence and professional curiosity, eased Tom's reluctance. He gave a curt nod. Carefully, Felix opened the box and began examining each piece. He paused at a letter postmarked from 1947 addressed to Colonel Harold Marshall. The writing, faded but legible, was in neat cursive. Tom had glanced at it before, gleaning little more than it was from someone in Switzerland, referencing funds and some kind of agreement. The letter closed with a signature C. Bauer. Tom had never made the connection. To him, it was just an old war buddy or a random acquaintance. But now, seeing Bauer there, he felt a jolt of realization. Felix's expression turned solemn. "This is from my grandfather," he whispered. "Conrad Bauer. He worked in a Swiss bank that covertly assisted Allied intelligence. They uncovered accounts filled with looted assets the Nazis tried to hide. Gold, art, currency stuff stolen from families who never made it out of the war." Tom's heart thumped. It felt as though a door to the past had just creaked open, unveiling a secret corridor. He remembered the colonel mentioning, just once, that he had helped track down hidden war treasures, but the details were so sparse that Tom hadn't paid much attention. Now the puzzle pieces began aligning. A Swiss banker named Bauer and Colonel Harold Marshall had apparently struck some arrangement. Felix gently removed a small key taped to the back of the letter. The key was unremarkable, except for the faint words etched on its side, Zürich Trust. I believe this unlocks an account containing funds that were never claimed after the war. Felix explained, your grandfather and mine agreed these resources would be used to combat the same kind of oppression they fought against, should it reemerge in another form. They feared that after the war ended, economic powers would eventually replicate the same controlling structures, just without the guns. Tom's pulse quickened. It was almost too large a revelation to handle war booty, Swiss bank accounts, a clandestine partnership between two families. It all sounded like a spy novel. But as he recalled the colonel's stories, it made a bizarre kind of sense. Are you telling me there might be money or resources for me, for this farm? Felix closed the box with a soft click. More than just money, he said, meeting Tom's stare. It's a fund meant to ensure that families and communities aren't swallowed by corporate entities wielding unchecked power. It's about preserving independence, exactly the kind of independence your grandfather fought for overseas, and exactly what you're fighting for now. Tom slumped into a chair, his mind whirling. Outside, the tractor stood as tangible proof of how this Swiss man's skill had already made a dent in Tom's immediate problems. But the possibility that an even greater source of help existed, rooted in a decades-old promise, left him both hopeful and deeply unsettled. Was this the lifeline he needed? Or was it another trapdoor with hidden conditions? As the last remnants of the storm clouds drifted beyond the horizon, Tom felt the winds of change coursing through his old farmhouse, stirring long dormant secrets into life. The next morning arrived with a subdued brightness, the air smelling of damp earth and renewal. Tom found himself sitting at the kitchen table, the letter and key from 1947 spread out before him. Felix, now dressed in a simple flannel shirt, was preparing coffee as though he'd lived there 4 years. The tension in Tom's shoulders told him this was no casual morning. Today they would delve deeper into the colonel's legacy and whatever this Zürich Trust might mean for Meadow Springs Farm. Before they could begin, the phone rang. A man introduced himself as Harold Doyle, a representative from Land Dominion Group. Doyle spoke in an overtly friendly tone, asking if Tom had reconsidered any of their buyout proposals. He mentioned the recent storm damage in the area, hinting that Land Dominion could help mitigate repair costs if Tom signed over the property. Tom gritted his teeth, a pang of anger mixing with fear in his chest. This was a well-timed tactic, and clearly, the conglomerate had people on the ground assessing which farms were most vulnerable post-storm. Felix watched Tom's side of the conversation with a steady gaze, as though reading every nuance of Tom's posture and tone. Once Tom hung up uncommitted but refusing the immediate offer, Felix spoke calmly. Land Dominion is like many large corporations I've monitored. They apply pressure in cycles, waiting for the perfect moment when owners feel cornered. This storm gave them an excuse to push. Tom nodded, feeling a renewed sense of urgency to explore whatever resources might lie within that Swiss bank account. Felix explained that his own grandfather had curated a confidential ledger of assets belonging to war victims who had no surviving heirs. Those unclaimed holdings had been quietly safeguarded, with the intention to be used when another form of oppressive control arose. According to Felix, he had spent the last decade verifying that these assets were still intact and gathering interest in a special trust account, one that required identification from Colonel Marshall's bloodline to unlock. It's not just about paying off your debts, Felix continued, tapping the letter. Your grandfather's vision was to help communities remain autonomous. He believed that corporate monopolies on essential resources like farmland or water posed the same threat as a dictatorship. Different battlefield. Same outcome, people lose freedom when one power source controls everything. Skepticism gnawed at Tom. He'd never heard such grand rhetoric from the colonel, only glimpses of regret and caution whenever the war was mentioned. Could the colonel really have orchestrated something this elaborate, in secret? And if so, why had Tom's parents never known? Felix surmised that perhaps the colonel had chosen to keep certain wartime secrets guarded, hoping that if they were never needed, they could lie dormant. But now, with corporate pressure mounting, it seemed that the time had come to reveal the hidden resources. Felix suggested that Tom find a secure way to contact the Swiss banking officials. They would need documented proof of Tom's lineage, the original letter, and the key for verification. Time is of the essence, Felix said gently. Land Dominion isn't going to wait. Tom felt the weight of it all pressing against his chest. One call to a Swiss bank could change not just his life, but the fate of every small farm in the region. Yet the gravity of what he might discover, both financially and morally, made his hands tremble as he reached for the telephone. Before Tom could make that call, fate intervened in the form of community. Around mid-morning, several trucks rumbled into the muddy yard neighbors from surrounding farms who had banded together through the worst of times. Leading the convoy was Clay Addison, a stout man whose family had raised hogs and corn for generations. Right behind him was Glenn Patterson, known for his orchard of apple and cherry trees on the eastern slope. Lastly, Norman Carter arrived, a middle-aged farmer who had been grappling with heart trouble while trying to keep his vegetable fields profitable. They all piled into Tom's living room, a mix of worry and camaraderie etched on their sun-worn faces. Clay explained the situation without sugarcoating. Land Dominion had arrived at his farm the day after the storm, offering a hefty sum if he'd sign over his acreage immediately. Glenn chimed in, saying they had offered to cover the cost of replacing his battered irrigation lines, but only if he agreed to a contract that effectively gave them a controlling share of his orchard. Norman stayed quiet, but his eyes spoke volumes about the pressure and his own mounting medical bills. The group settled into the mismatched chairs and couch, sharing updates and rumors that had circulated since the storm. Several local farmers were ready to capitulate, some out of sheer exhaustion, others because they simply saw no other path to solvency. Meadow Springs Farm, with Tom's water rights and strategic location, was considered a crucial domino that, if it fell, would leave the rest vulnerable. Tom introduced Felix, describing him as a Swiss engineer who had shown up unexpectedly and mended the tractor. At first, the neighbors seemed to regard Felix with the same suspicion Tom initially held. But as Tom recounted the story of how Felix might possess links to a Swiss trust money set aside for exactly this kind of situation, they shifted from doubt to cautious curiosity. Felix, maintaining a polite humility, explained in broad strokes that war reparations and unclaimed assets had been secured in a special account. The initial confusion in the room was palpable. Clay frowned, stating it sounded too much like a tall tale. Glenn asked if there was some scam going on, given how improbable the story felt. Felix answered each question evenly, acknowledging how unusual it was, but also emphasizing that these funds were intended to shield small communities from predatory power structures, a modern reflection of the tyranny so many had fought against decades ago. Norman, who had served briefly in the army before returning to farm, asked pointedly about proof. Felix gestured to the letter from 1947 and the key inscribed with Zürich Trust. He mentioned legal documents, hidden archives, and Swiss banking laws that could confirm every detail. Watching the men's faces, Tom realized he wasn't alone in this swirling storm of possibilities. They, too, yearned for a lifeline. The question was whether they had the faith and tenacity to believe in an old colonel's improbable legacy and to unite around it. The conversation hovered on the brink of action. If the trust was real, they could pool resources, possibly buy new machinery, fix irrigation systems, and collectively resist Land Dominion's hold. But it required a leap of faith in the formal verification from the Swiss bank. For a moment, the living room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock near the fireplace. Each man weighed the risk of trusting a half-century-old promise from across the ocean against the near certainty of being crushed by corporate acquisition. Determined to move forward, Tom led everyone into the small study where the phone line was slightly more reliable, an area that once served as the colonel's office. Felix dialed a secure number he claimed was for a specialized division within a Swiss bank. The bank, he explained, was under heavy privacy regulations, but they maintained a discreet channel for matters related to unclaimed wartime assets. All eyes were on Tom as he took the receiver. A polite Swiss-accented voice answered on the other end. What followed was a multi-layered authentication process that felt more like high-level spycraft than banking. Tom was asked for codes that Felix read off from the 1947 letter. for verification of Colonel Harold Marshall's date and place of birth, and even for certain details from the colonel's military record. Through it all, Tom's pulse pounded, each question making him realize just how meticulously his grandfather and Conrad Bauer had planned for this scenario. The final step involved the small key. Tom described the inscription, reciting each letter and mark, then held his breath as the bank official went silent. Minutes passed, the tension in the room was tangible. At last, the voice returned, confirming that the key matched the archived record in their system. They requested scanned copies of the letter and any related documents, along with Tom's identification, to finalize the claim. The call ended with an appointment to continue the procedure via a secure video link the following day. Tom placed the receiver down, exhaling a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. No one spoke at first, but then Norman let out a dry chuckle. "If I hadn't heard that myself, I'd say you were all losing it." Clay nodded, arms crossed, his gaze shifting to Felix as if to say, "All right, maybe you're not a charlatan after all." Glenn, however, looked anxious. "So what if the money's real?" "How fast can we get it, Jan? Dominion is offering me a deal with a 10-day deadline. After that, they say my orchard won't fetch the same price." Felix answered that he couldn't guarantee lightning-fast transfers, but if everything checked out, the funds could be unlocked within a few weeks at most. He also pointed out that this wasn't just about bailing out individuals. The trust's purpose was to create a cooperative structure that would keep farmland under local control, preventing corporate monopolies. Tom remembered the colonel's words in that old letter. Freedom can be lost not only by force of arms, but by the slow entrapment of financial conquest. The line gave Tom chills now, because it felt like the colonel was speaking across time, describing exactly the predicament that small farms faced. The group lingered in the study, discussing how they might rally other farmers in the county. If half the region was on the brink of being bought out, perhaps a unified stand, backed by these mysterious funds, could change everything. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the men eventually filed out to head back to their own properties. They left with more questions than answers, but also a glimmer of hope. Felix handed Tom a short list of documents he'd need to gather: birth certificates, farm deeds, tax records, anything that might solidify his legal standing as Harold Marshall's heir. For Tom, the day had started with a broken tractor and a swirl of corporate threats. It ended with the possibility that Meadow Springs Farm might not only survive, but become a linchpin for saving every independent farmer in the county. At dawn the next day, Tom rose early to prepare for the secure video call with the Swiss banking official. Felix had arranged a makeshift station in the study, using a laptop he'd pulled from the Porsche, along with some sort of mobile hotspot device that provided a surprisingly strong signal. By 6:30 a.m., they were logged into a private conference link. An impeccably dressed Swiss banker appeared on screen, thin-rimmed glasses, polite smile, polished English laced with a Swiss inflection. Over the next hour, Tom found himself navigating a labyrinth of legal protocols. The banker displayed scanned wartime documents that listed Colonel Harold Marshall and Conrad Bauer as co-signatories on a trust. Certain clauses specified that any unclaimed assets from Nazi loot where heirs couldn't be located would be designated to a cause preserving free enterprise from monopolistic or totalitarian structures. As the text read, it was almost uncanny how precisely it matched the situation with land dominion. They needed official proof of Tom's lineage, birth certificates, property deeds, and the colonel's discharge papers became crucial. Tom shuffled through files in an old steel cabinet, cursing the disorganized piles. Each time he produced a relevant paper, the Swiss banker nodded appreciatively, uploading digital scans for the record. By the end, the banker said it would take roughly 10 to 14 business days to finalize everything, assuming no irregularities emerged. Once that happened, a considerable amount Felix believed it could be in the millions would be accessible for authorized disbursement. After the call ended, Tom slumped into an armchair, drained yet oddly energized. If all went well, the trust could release enough money to rescue not just his farm, but others in dire straits. It wasn't a bottomless pit of cash, but it could buy time. new machinery, pay off looming debts, and most critically, prevent land dominion from establishing a chokehold on local agriculture. Felix leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "It's a start," he said quietly. "But money alone isn't a solution. The colonel and my grandfather envisioned a cooperative model. Shared equipment, shared processing, maybe even a shared distribution network, so none of you remain isolated." The notion stirred memories of Tom's father speaking wistfully about farmer cooperatives that had existed before big corporations came in. "Yeah," Tom mused. "We can't just accept a one-time bailout. We need a structure." Already, his mind teemed with ideas. Perhaps each farm could become a stakeholder in a community-run entity that managed equipment, water rights, and negotiations with larger distributors. On top of that, they could create a local brand to sell directly to markets rather than getting undercut by massive supply chains. For a man who'd felt cornered and hopeless just days ago, it felt almost giddy to consider such possibilities. Felix walked over and patted Tom on the shoulder. "Your colonel was a visionary, but you'll need to be the one who makes this real," he said. Outside, sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating the study where battered war memorabilia now shared space with digital technology bridging continents. A sense of momentum built, as though each object in that room, from an old army medal to the modern laptop, stood at the intersection of past sacrifice and future promise. That afternoon, news of Tom's breakthrough trickled across the community. In an impromptu gathering at Clay Addison's barn, more spacious than Tom's living room, a dozen local farmers and their spouses arrived to hear the story. Word spread that Tom had discovered a hidden trust fund tied to Colonel Harold Marshall's World War II exploits, and that it might bankroll a cooperative effort to keep them all afloat. Felix attended, standing quietly off to one side. His posture radiated the calm confidence of someone used to orchestrating complex operations. Tom felt a rush of nerves as he recounted the details in front of so many people. He explained the Swiss bank, the verification process, the potential funds. He also emphasized that the colonel's plan wasn't simply to hand out cash, but to unite the farms into a single protective entity, a bulwark against the creeping tide of corporate takeover. As Tom spoke, he sensed a shift in the room. Some eyes lit with cautious optimism, while others glinted with doubt or even suspicion. Beth Carlyle, whose family had lost 2 pastures to land dominion the year before, raised a pressing question: how do we know this is real? Scams happen all the time. And even if it's real, what's to stop land dominion from using lawyers and politicians to challenge us in court? Felix stepped forward, acknowledging her concern. "I've studied how these corporations operate. They thrive on farmers being isolated, lacking resources for protracted legal battles. This trust fund can cover legal fees, hire expert counsel, and help you form a legally binding cooperative with robust contracts. If the farmland is held or operated under this cooperative's umbrella, it becomes much harder for outsiders to buy out individuals one by one." The mention of legal battles triggered murmurs throughout the barn. Some had already tangled with land dominion's attorneys. The prospect of meeting them on equal footing felt both daunting and exhilarating. Clay Addison stood up and said he was tired of living on the defensive. "If we can form something like a barn grange, a union of smallholders, maybe we have a shot." Norman Carter, normally stoic, rose next. He admitted how his health issues had tempted him to sell just to pay his medical bills. But if there was a cooperative system that could handle equipment upgrades and expansion, maybe his farm could remain viable for the next generation. "We owe it to our kids, or grandkids, to at least try," he said, voice cracking slightly. Tom observed the emotional undercurrent swirling through the crowd. This wasn't merely about money, it was about dignity, independence, and the inheritance each farm represented. Meadow Springs Farm had been in his family for decades, but so had many of the others. Each had stories of sacrifice, heartbreak, and perseverance. Now they might all converge into one collective stand against the slow strangulation of corporate acquisition. By the end of the meeting, the group voted to proceed with forming a steering committee for the cooperative. They agreed to put forth a small team to draft bylaws explore governance structures, and wait for the final confirmation from the Swiss bank. Hope mingled with anxiety, but at least now they had a plan. As the crowd dispersed, Tom caught Felix's eye and offered a grateful nod. Felix returned it with a measured smile, well aware that the real battle had only just begun. Within days, the intangible dream of a community cooperative began to take shape. Volunteers gathered at the local high school's old library room, turning it into a makeshift headquarters. Folding tables were piled with laptops, farmer notebooks, and battered binders full of property records. Clay Addison took the lead on drafting the cooperative's framework. He had experience negotiating dairy contracts, after all. Glenn Patterson offered to handle marketing strategy, fantasizing about labeling orchard products under a new local brand to fetch premium prices. Norman Carter, determined to stay active despite his health setbacks, researched the finer points of water rights law. Felix mostly floated between groups, offering counsel based on an uncanny depth of knowledge from supply chain logistics to legal boilerplate. When asked how he knew all this, Felix would typically shrug and say he'd done some consulting in various places. Over the course of one conversation, though, he let slip that he had once served in a special branch of the Swiss Armed Forces, where analyzing logistical choke points was standard procedure. It was exactly the type of skill set needed to spot Land Dominion's next move. Meanwhile, Tom was neck-deep in two tasks. The first was finalizing the Swiss bank paperwork. He made daily calls, scanning documents, verifying details of the colonel's war record, and rescanning forms whenever the bank found minor inconsistencies. The second was rallying more farmers to join the cause. He crisscrossed the county in the freshly repaired John Deere, or his old pickup, explaining the vision. Some folks received him with open arms, others scoffed in disbelief, and a few said they'd consider signing on once the money was truly in hand. As the cooperative solidified, Land Dominion ramped up their pressure. Company representatives visited every holdout farm, usually with smooth-talking suits promising financial security or a graceful transition. They dropped fresh flyers in mailboxes and even ran local radio ads claiming to partner with the communities for a sustainable future. But the veneer wore thin when at least two farmers alleged they found suspicious damage to their equipment right after turning down an offer. Felix suspected sabotage. He studied the broken parts belts corroded by chemicals, hoses that looked intentionally slashed. It felt alarmingly similar to what he'd observed with Tom's tractor belt. He showed Tom photographic evidence, pointing out distinctive chemical patterns that indicated deliberate tampering. This added a new layer of urgency. If Land Dominion resorted to underhanded tactics, the cooperative needed to be prepared to document and, if necessary, pursue legal action. Despite the increasing tension, the local high school library buzzed with productivity. Teens volunteering for extracurricular credit helped set up spreadsheets and community social media pages. Elders who rarely touched a computer tried their hand at data entry. Conversations that started with uncertain politeness turned into jokes and laughter as farmers discovered how much they had in common. Yes, they were battered by storms and harassed by corporate buyout teams. But for the first time in years, many felt a collective energy they couldn't recall since the colonel's generation, when neighbors pooled their labor to build barns and harvest each other's fields. The moment of truth came 2 weeks later. Tom, joined by Felix and a handful of others, huddled around a laptop in the high school library's back room. They had a scheduled video conference with the Swiss bank official, who appeared on screen looking as crisp as ever, but this time accompanied by a senior banking manager. After a brief introduction, the banker announced that all documents had been verified, and the trust account in question was officially recognized in Tom Marshall's name as the rightful heir to Colonel Harold Marshall's estate. The sum was staggering. Even after currency conversions and administrative fees, it totaled enough to not only pay off urgent debts across multiple farms, but also invest in new equipment, build shared storage facilities, and hire a legal team. The bank official explained how the trust had been drawing interest for decades. A hush fell over the small gathering, broken only by the muffled cheers from the rest of the farmers who'd been watching from a larger monitor in the next room. Tom felt a swirl of gratitude, relief, and an undercurrent of fear. With this money came a responsibility he hadn't fully comprehended. He thought of the colonel's unwavering gaze in the old photographs, those stern eyes that believed in uprightness even when the world lurched into chaos. This was a second chance, a guardian fund for the entire community, and it had to be used wisely or risk repeating the mistakes that had allowed corporate giants to flourish. They arranged for an immediate wire transfer into a specially created cooperative account, set up under the newly formed Meadow Springs Agricultural Alliance. The bank offered guidance to ensure that the funds would be earmarked according to the colonel's intended purpose, supporting independent agriculture and thwarting monopolistic encroachment. Within hours, the first portion of the funds landed, a symbolic deposit that triggered applause and a few misty-eyed grins among the onlookers. Yet the victory was not complete. Almost as if on cue, Land Dominion sent out a press release the very next day accusing certain individuals of conspiring to block economic progress and sabotage the region's opportunity for technological advancement in agriculture. They implied that outside money was meddling in local affairs without proper oversight. The local newspaper, owned in part by Land Dominion affiliates, ran a headline questioning the legitimacy of a Swiss war-era trust. Suddenly, rumors swirled about legal challenges. The possibility that the trust could be tied up in court if Land Dominion petitioned for an investigation. Felix responded calmly. He pointed out that the colonel and Conrad Bauer had taken elaborate steps to ensure legality, and any court could investigate their documentation. The records were unassailable, but Land Dominion's tactic was clear: sow doubt and stall. Already, a handful of fence-sitters began questioning whether they should accept the cooperative arrangement or jump ship and take the safer route of an immediate corporate payout. Meanwhile, the farmers who had already joined the alliance rolled up their sleeves. They had enough funds now to purchase collective machinery, upgrade broken irrigation systems, and settle the most pressing mortgages. For some, it was like breathing fresh air after years of suffocation. The Alliance's leadership committee scheduled a big public meeting for the following week, hoping to demonstrate tangible results: brand new tractors, repaired silos, and real numbers on how much each farm could save by pooling resources. It was time to show that the colonel's vision, channeled through Tom's reluctant stewardship, was more than a legend. It was a living, breathing testament to what a community could accomplish when it refused to kneel before unchecked power. The following week, Meadow Springs Farm bustled with activity as the Alliance members decided to host their public meeting right there, under a large open-sided tent near Tom's fields. The newly acquired tractors gleamed in the sunlight, a row of green and red behemoths that symbolized a collective future. Tables were set up displaying plans for a shared grain mill, a small dairy processing facility, and a cooperative orchard program. Children ran between bales of hay, giggling and sneaking cookies from the refreshment table, while the older folks, some wearing Waibai de Tuera pins in honor of the colonel, mingled in small knots of conversation. Tom stood at the edge of the gathering, wearing his usual jeans and boots, feeling uncharacteristically self-conscious. Felix hovered nearby, offering the occasional word of encouragement. The entire day felt surreal, as if they were living out a scene from a distant dream. But it was real. The trust fund had cleared, the cooperative had formed, and farmers who once considered themselves doomed to corporate buyouts now had a fighting chance. When the moment came for Tom to step up to the microphone, he cleared his throat, looking out at neighbors, friends, and even a few curious cynics from nearby towns. He spoke simply, from the heart. Meadow Springs Farm has been in my family since my grandfather, Colonel Harold Marshall, returned from the war. He saw how fragile freedom could be when too few people held too much power. He believed that farmland and the freedom to farm it independently was worth protecting. What we're doing here today isn't about just one man or one trust fund. It's about preserving a way of life, one that respects the land and the people who tend it. A hush fell over the crowd. Tom held up the small key inscribed with the Zürich Trust. This key opened more than an account. He continued. It opened a doorway between our past and our future. It reminded me, and I hope it reminds all of you, that the sacrifices made decades ago still echo today. If we stand together, using these resources responsibly, we can keep our farms, our water, our harvests, and our independence out of the hands of anyone who would see it all reduced to corporate profit margins. The applause that followed was thunderous in its sincerity. Felix stepped up next, outlining how the cooperative's legal structure would operate, how each member farm would maintain its own identity, but also share in equipment, marketing, and legal representation. He mentioned how the Colonel and Conrad Bauer had foresight, bridging continents to defend freedom in a new era. People listened with rapt attention, some teary-eyed, some nodding vigorously in agreement. Night fell slowly, a deep orange sky fading into purples and blues. Strings of lights illuminated the tent, laughter and conversation echoing across the fields. The orchard owners discussed new cider presses. The dairy farmers debated packaging options for cheese, and the row crop growers planned logistics for next season. Tom and Felix wandered a bit away from the tent. Standing at the edge of the wheat, the cool evening breeze rustled the stalks, a soothing sound that spoke of future harvests yet to come. "I'll be moving on soon," Felix said gently, as though reading Tom's thoughts. "My role was to help unlock what your colonel put in place. Now this is in your hands." Tom nodded, feeling an odd mixture of gratitude and sadness. Over the past weeks, Felix had come to represent not just a solution, but also a link to something greater, a testament that good deeds set in motion decades ago could still blossom. Tom glanced back at the tent, where people were forging a new chapter in their local history. For the first time in a very long time, he felt certain that Meadow Springs Farm and every farm around it had a chance. They would endure, they would thrive, and they would do so on their own terms, preserving a hard-won freedom for generations yet to come. Now that you've followed our characters through treacherous storms, broken machinery, and the revelation of a Swiss bank account rooted in World War II secrets, we arrive at a hopeful conclusion. In the end, the old tractor is more than just a machine. It's a symbol of resilience passed down from one generation to the next. Our protagonist embraces the unexpected legacy with gratitude, sharing newfound resources to uplift his neighbors and preserve the land they cherish. Together, they transform a dire situation into a community-wide revival, one that honors the sacrifices of the past while securing a brighter future for everyone involved. From my perspective, this story reminds us that even when hope seems lost, unity and determination can spark a powerful change. What did you think of this journey? I'd love to know your favorite moments, insights, or any questions that popped up along the way. Share your thoughts in the comments so we can keep the conversation going. Thank you for being part of this story, and I look forward to hearing your opinions and ideas.